easier, but I won't go into as much detail as I did in the dedicated course for type scales, right? Because it's pointless to repeat the same information. Now, let's see about some key takeaways for this lesson. To properly define the typography of your project, there are a few steps you need to follow. First, decide where you want to get your fonts from. I recommend Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts. Then decide which fonts would work best for the brand and audience, based on the message you want your website to convey. Fonts should also be picked using criteria like readability and loading time. After you picked your fonts, you need to set the proper roles and attributes like size, line height, weight, etc. All right, so now that you got this introduction to typography, let's focus on our project and see what fonts we'll be using and how we'll be using those. Coming up. All right, so let's follow the steps that I described previously and pick the right typography characteristics for our project. Let's begin. First step, let's pick where we'll get our fonts from. Personally, I'm a big fan of Adobe Fonts. I have access to the service, and this is what I'll use. Next step is to pick the fonts that would work well with the brand and the audience and the message that we're trying to convey. So if we look back at the project brief, all the way down here under Design and Guidelines, it says that Robert wants a modern looking website, and he likes to keep things clean and simple. So in terms of fonts, when I hear the word modern, I immediately think sans serif, right? And if you don't know what the difference is between serif and sans serif, well, let me show you. This one right here is a serif. See these embellishments on the letters? Well, these are called serifs. But a sans serif or without serif is just a cleaner looking typeface, right? You can't see any of the serifs here because, well, there are none. And usually serifs are considered to be more classic, more old school typefaces, while sans serifs are considered to be modern. So we settled on sans serifs. Now, which ones? Because there are so many, right? If we click on this category, we have almost 800 font families of sans serifs in Google Fonts. Well, Robert is what? A UI designer, right? So let's think about what keywords come into mind when we think UI designer. One of them could be geometry, right? So maybe geometric. Well, there is such a thing as a geometric typeface. It's one of the classifications. And there are a couple of geometric typefaces out there, one of which is Brandon Grotesque. And Brandon Grotesque looks something like this. You can see all the different fonts here. This looks really good. Adobe Fonts also shows you some use cases here on the top. And I think for this type of website, for a designer's portfolio, basically, this font family would work awesome. So this is one of the fonts that we'll be using, Brandon Grotesque from Adobe Fonts. Now, I'll be using two typefaces in this design, and I'll be using Brandon for the larger elements like headings. So that means we need another typeface that I'll be using for the smaller elements like the body text, captions, button, menu items, and so on. And you can Google this stuff. You'll find font pairings, font combinations from different foundries. But from my experience, I know that Brandon Grotesque pairs very well with Proxima Nova. This is another sans serif typeface, which looks something like this. It's relatively similar to Brandon Grotesque, but also has a distinct characteristic. And Proxima Nova also works well on smaller font sizes. Like if I were to reduce this to like 18 or even 16 pixels, and I try to read the text here, it's very readable, right? And it looks very good, even in bold, italic. It works very well. In contrast, if I were to use Brandon Grotesque in smaller font sizes, right, it's readable, but it's not as readable, in my opinion, as Proxima Nova. So these are the two typefaces that we're going to use, Brandon Grotesque and Proxima Nova. So once we install these on our system, we can jump back to our design software, and we need to determine the roles and the attributes. So for that, I'm going to create a frame, and I'm going to call it typography. And inside, I'm just going to start listing a couple of elements that I want to showcase. Elements like a paragraph, just some dummy text for now. Let's just resize this. And for font size, I'm going to use 21, which is our base font size, and the line height is going to be 30. All right, so that's going to give me an exact representation of what my paragraphs will look like. And I can even go one step further and choose the exact color that we're going to be using. Let's say black 75, something like that. Next up, we're going to make a list of all the headings that we plan on using. So we start with heading 1, or you can start with heading 6, the other way around. It's really up to you. Let's start with heading 1, heading 2, and let's duplicate this, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, let's set their font family to Brandon Grotesque. Let's make all of these bold. Now, let's set their font sizes. For that, we're going to use a nice tool called Typescale. So we'll go to typescale.com. And this is a tool that creates typographic scales, the thing I mentioned earlier in the course. So with a typographic scale, it's very simple. You start with a base font size and a scale or a ratio. And the algorithm basically creates font sizes based on these two elements by multiplying the base font size with the scale, and then just keep repeating that process until you get this, right? So for example, 16 pixels multiplied by 1.25 will equal 20 pixels. 20 pixels multiplied by 1.250 is going to be equal to 25. And so on. You take this, you multiply it with the scale, you get to the next value, and the next, and the next, and the next, and so on. So for our project, we're going to use a base font size of 21 pixels, so a bit larger than usual, but because Robert wanted an airy website with lots of white space, I think a larger than usual typography will serve us well. And when it comes to the scale, it goes something like this. The smaller the ratio, the smaller the contrast between lower font sizes and bigger font sizes. And you'll see that as I'm increasing the scale, the contrast between small and big gets more and more obvious. And if I go like to a golden ratio, you can see that it's a crazy amount of contrast between this and this. For this type of project, I will choose an augmented fourth scale, or 1.414. And this gives me a nice balance between smaller font sizes and bigger font sizes. So once I do that, All I have to do is reference this tool and apply the font sizes to my elements here. So the first one, heading 1, is 118.70, and we're going to round that up to 119. So 119. And also the line height. This is very important. In Figma, you actually get a bit of help. If you delete the original value and leave it on auto, Figma will kind of calculate that for you based on a certain multiplier. But to truly see if you're happy with the line height, you can just enter some additional lines of text and then work on this, experiment with different values until you find that this text looks as it should. In my case, 144 is the correct line height that I'm looking for. There's not too much space between the lines, but not too little either. For example, if I were to set this at 90, the text would kind of be crammed in this very small space, and I don't want that. So 144 it is for the heading 1. And following this exact same procedure, I do the rest of the headings. So for heading 2, I will use 84 pixels of line height, of font size, excuse me, and for the line height, I'm going to set it to 112. And I'll keep doing that for the rest of the headings. So after doing that, the type scale looks something like this. We have the heading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now let's see about font weights. Because these are headings, most of them will be bold, but every now and then I think kind of a change in this rhythm can be beneficial. So what I like to usually do is have the heading 3 use a different font weight, usually something that's a lot different than the others, like light. So heading 1 and 2 will be bold, 4, 5, and 6 will be bold, but heading 3 will be light. And I think this will create some nice visual interest in the page. It will contrast really well with the other headings, and overall I think it's going to be a welcome change. And finally, what I like to do is name these frames to also reflect the base font size and also the ratio. Just so I know in the future, if I want to change something or I want to add another element in the mix, I know exactly what the base font size was and the ratio. And then, of course, if we want, we can select all of these. We can give them the color of black. And we can even create text styles for them. So we can select our paragraph, go to text, click on these buttons, click on plus, paragraph. This, H1, H2, H3, and so on. We'll do the same for the other 3. And that's it. That's how you get your typography started with Figma and this great tool called Typescale. There is another tool I wanted to show you that's called Archetype. And with this tool, you can pick your fonts here. You can define the various sizes for the base paragraph, for the scale ratio, and you can see a nice preview here. Personally, I prefer working with Typescale. I find it much faster to use. It's much more fluid. But as an alternative, Archetype is also there if you need it. Okay, so with the typography taken care of, let's see about some key takeaways. Start your typography process by defining the type scale, font weights, and line heights. Use tools like Typescale and Archetype to make this task easier. If your design app allows it, create text styles for elements like headings and paragraphs.